So, I talked about stylometry briefly, but now we are doing the more traditional application of stylometry, which is authorship attribution. Or rather, we are using authorship attribution as an excuse to study Seychellois Creole, because it's a very, I'm thinking minor language in the Deleuzian sense, but a very marginalized and small language. So in authorship attribution, famously, it's been used, for example, by Patrick Juola to figure out that The Cuckoo's Calling was written by J.K. Rowling. It was used by Binongo to figure out that Ruth Thompson wrote, I think, the 15th book of Oz instead of Frank Baum. It was used by Ariuna Tutsi to figure out that who Elena Ferrante is, if you've heard of her. So it has many applications and many projects. So people make linguistic choices. I can choose to call it a tennis shoe. You may call it a trainer. It's the same across languages. You have synonyms. We have lexical choices, morphological choices, syntactic, semantic, etc. So stylometric theory is language independent, and research has confirmed it for many languages. Personally, I work mostly in Spanish and English. There's less work done on African languages, Australian, Native American languages, and little to none done on Creoles. The main reason that there's not much work on Creoles is that we don't really have enough material on Creole languages to build corpora. So Creole languages are defined as new languages that develop out of a need for communication between people that do not share a common language. So for example, the Louisiana Creole arose out of contact between African slaves and French colonizers during the period of 1699 and 1750. The properties of Creole are subject to dispute, but generally they have a smaller vocabulary, they have less synonyms and the like, less complex structure, minimal use of inflections, lack of tone distinctions, and semantically regular derivations, in comparison to older languages that have had much more time to develop complexity. And this is because they are languages that arise out of a necessity in passing, so they often arise in port towns and the like. So how will this affect stylometric analysis? Because essentially we have smaller vocabulary. Well, does that mean that we have smaller feature spaces and less features to analyze? Does a less complex structure allow for fewer opportunities for syntactic variation? For example, you can use the simple present, I do X, versus the present continuous, I am doing X. But as we'll see later with Seychellois Creole, this is not the case. So the Creole continuum, a dialect continuum of varieties of a Creole language between those most at least similar to a super straight language. So in this case, this is Guyanese Creole. The super straight language is English. And the other one is a mixture of African languages, if I remember correctly. So as you can see, any speaker of Creole can choose any combination in the continuum to make a sense unit. So in a way, they do have stylistic choices. For example, closest to English is I gave him one. Then we lose the past marker, and I say I give him one. And we pick it up again, but instead of having it in specific words, right, like I gave, did, and later been, become the past marker. So it's I did give him one, or I did give him one, and so on, until we get a longer structure, me being give him one. So users make choices about level, which gives us an equivalent amount of variability, hopefully, to older languages. So the research question is, does stylometric analyses and for authorship attribution work on Creole languages? And if it does, so what? Well, it turns out that stylometric analysis helps law enforcement. As you can see, it helps scholarship, especially with the previous paper that was presented. It helps medical and psychological diagnosis. As I mentioned in my previous talk, MBTI type can be profiled. I'm personally working on profiling mental illness. So it has many applications that would be useful to a population. Anyways, Seychellois Creole specifically. The Republic of Seychelles are a small group of islands about 1,500 kilometers east of Africa. The original languages, the official languages are English, French, and Creole or Seychellois. The latter is a mixture of French, which is the acrolect and the main lexifier, and an unknown basilect languages. Creole is used as the official language of the Seychelles National Assembly, which is where we gathered our corpus. So a little bit of history. In the 1770s, French colonists, mainly from Mauritius, settled in the Seychelles. Their slaves spoke Mauritian Creole, which to this day is mutually intelligible with Seychellois Creole. In 1835, the British abolished slavery and set Bantu slaves free in the Seychelles. And by free, I mean, they got rid of all their slaves, they just dumped them in an island and left them there. So it takes until the 70s for them to be independent from Britain. And it's not until 1982, even though the Creole was an official language earlier, that the Creole becomes an official language of instruction and, more importantly, the language of the National Assembly. So let's look at the Lord's Prayer. My French is awful, so I'm not going to try much. Just notice, ou nous papa qui dans le ciel versus notre Père qui est au ciel. Our Dad in the sky versus our Father who is in the heavens. Remember, the differences of lexical choices. French has more formal and more informal words, right? Like papa in French is informal. Le ciel, which is the plural for à le ciel, gets transformed into le ciel. Likewise, père to papa. So Creole, Seychellois, let's call it, does not mark singular versus plural explicitly. It is, if it's important, the phrase ban le ciel, a band of skies, would be used. So ban, this band, is used to mark the plural, just like in Mauritian Creole, bin or did was used to mark the past. So we collected 10 speeches each from 10 speakers for 100 total speeches in the National Assembly. This is the source, and if you want, obviously we can tell you which speakers we use so you can replicate this study. Likewise, in the one before, I had to use copyrighted material, but please ask and I shall deliver. Lengths of speeches were widely varying, and we just got what we could get. But chance performance with 10 different authors would be 10% correct. So we used it analyzing leave one out cross-validation in order to see if we could correctly attribute each speech to the actual speaker. For pre-processing, we normalized it into ASCII, we unified the case, we stripped punctuations, and normalized white space. The 5 methods used were the 50 most frequent words, character n-grams, so 4 grams and 10 grams, word 2 grams, which are collocations essentially, and word lengths. Now these are the effectiveness of each, so how many were correctly attributed. As you can see, we have 100 samples, so percentages are pretty natural, but random guess would again produce 1 in 10. And even the histogram of word length, which only did 33% accurately, is significantly above chance. Which means that authorship attribution can be done in Seychellois Creole. So for discussion, and I'm sorry this was such a short talk, but I'm nervous, so I talked quite fast. Despite potential differences between older languages and Creole, authorship attribution still works. The Creole continuum is probably not an issue because National Assembly speech is a well-defined high-prestige register in its own right. So the question would be, since it's the official language of instruction in schools, well, would this still hold with school texts, right? With texts that are not as normalized and well-defined in their register. For future work, we want a larger, better, more balanced corpus with more genres of speaking, and we want to study additional Creole languages. But the problem with studying Creole languages, as I said before, is that most of them are not official languages, right? So we don't really have, like the Seychellois people do, the minutes of a National Assembly or a corpus of literature. So we also want to compare it with other versions of French. We have actually already done Québécois with parliamentary records. And as a preview of the follow-up experiment, it turns out that it has the same accuracy in Québécois as it does in Seychellois Creole, almost to the letter. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.